Good evening, everyone. I'm Levi Darby. I'm honored to serve as the Director of Jewish Life at the Peninsula Jewish Community Center. And it is truly my great pleasure to welcome you this evening for the inaugural lecture of the 10th Annual North Peninsula Jewish Community Scholar in Residence Program. It's a remarkable milestone for this community. And since you're all here this evening in such numbers, you've given me the opportunity to use three of my very favorite words in the English language, which are standing room only. The Scholar in Residence program is the signature Jewish educational event of the North Peninsula Jewish community. It's conceived, created, and designed collaboratively by a consortium of Jewish organizations on the North Peninsula, including our synagogues, the day school, and of course the Peninsula Jewish Community Center. During this next week, our scholar, Dr. Michael Berenbaum, will present 4 different lectures, in addition to this one in each of our synagogues in the community, and he will also be teaching a class to the 7th and 8th graders of the Warnick Jewish Day School here in this room tomorrow morning. It's customary in our community after 10 years for people to travel around the community and follow our scholar to learn with him or her. People go to each other's synagogues to attend many of the lectures, even all of them. And if you do that this year, you may discover that this is what Jewish community feels like. People who don't necessarily cross each other's paths in the Jewish community, but we're going to each other's synagogues, and we are learning together. We're brought together by our desire to learn. And that is a feeling of strong community. We can be proud of the community that we live in. If you would like to find the complete schedule of Dr. Berenbaum's presentations, that you'll find them on the table in the lobby. Collectively, as a community, we especially want to offer our profound thanks to our funders, the Koret Foundation and the Toby Foundation for Jewish Life and Culture, for providing the financial support to make this program, in which all presentations are free to the public, possible. We're extremely grateful both for their vision and their generosity. We're also grateful to our donors, people like yourselves, for helping to make this program and all our Jewish peoplehood programs possible. And I also want to, at this moment, express thanks to Adam Eilat, the head of the Warnick School, and to the Warnick School and their community for hosting us and making this room available for our use this evening so we could fit all of you here. We have a sacred ritual at PJCC programs. Our aspiration to offer programs of the highest quality requires of us to ask for feedback from you, our audience. We have an evaluation form for you to fill out. It has only 4 questions on it. It's not 2-sided, it's not 1-sided, it's half a side. Very unusual. It will take you less than 2 minutes. You can find the evaluation form outside on the table, or perhaps it was handed to you as you walked in. Pencils are outside. When you fill them out, it would be a great goodness if you were to do that. You can leave your completed survey on the table in the lobby. As Paul suggested, oh, by the way, this is an apt moment to make sure that our cell phones are silenced. So please take a moment to check. As Paul suggested, all of us here this evening understand that this week's exploration of anti-Semitism is not only timely, but it is also of critical importance for the Jewish community and for the American community. The learning we embrace and share this week and the positive community action it can and may inspire in us are the very acts that can help prevent future anti-Semitic violence, as well as hatred of and violence against all those who are told that they have no place here, or they don't belong, or that they are somehow other. Our North Peninsula Jewish community is honored to have Dr. Michael Berenbaum as our guide in this adventure and exploration of learning. Dr. Berenbaum is a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles and currently serves as the university's director of the Sigi Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust. A 3-time winner of the American Jewish Press Association's Simon Rockower Memorial Award, Dr. Berenbaum has authored or edited more than 20 books, including Not Your Father's Antisemitism, Antisemitism in the Early 21st Century. From 1993 to 1998, Dr. Berenbaum was instrumental in the establishment of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. First as the project director overseeing its creation, and then as the inaugural director of its research institute. Additionally, he was president and CEO of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, now the USDC Shoah Foundation, the Institute for Visual History and Education, and his extensive work in film has been recognized with both Emmy and Academy Awards. Not an unimportant thing to mention about a gentleman who now is in Los Angeles. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our 2020 North Peninsula Jewish Community Scholar in Residence, Dr. Michael Berenbaum.
Thank you very much for an overly kind introduction. I have to tell you that the first award I ever received in the media had a terrible title with it. It was an award called the Silver Angel Award for Religion in the Media. Now, the problem when you win a Silver Angel Award is, whom can you tell? If I told my wife, she would say, I would like you to lift up the seat when you go to the men's room and put the cap on the toothpaste. She knew the non-angelic sides of me. If you tell your kids as they're teenagers, they think you are the opposite of an angel, you are the devil incarnate. 4 years later, when they leave home and come back from college, it's remarkable what you've learned over 4 years. And I did the only honorable thing a man can do under such circumstances, which is I told my mother. And my mother said to me, I know you're an angel, now try being a mensch. And that has been my lifelong responsibility. I too am sorry to see all of you. Not because I don't want to speak to an audience, but because if you would share a dream with me, I belong to a peculiar profession. I dreamed that someday I should live long enough to be irrelevant. Meaning that when we created the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the question is, what would be the good ending? The perfect ending would be, look how idiotic 20th century humanity was. We could never do this in the 21st century. But that's not the world we live in. When I speak on anti-Semitism, you can imagine back in the early 1990s, when our rabbinical school was being created at the American Jewish University, the Jewish community was wondering if anti-Semitism was a symptom of the past. By which they meant very simply that communism had died, and communism had died, and with it came the anti-Semitism that had been sponsored by the Soviet Union. Democracies were rising throughout all of Eastern Europe. The democracies wanted an affiliation with the West. They had enough residual anti-Semitism to believed that Jews controlled America and therefore they had to be good to the Jews not only in their country but in Jewish memory in Eastern Europe, and therefore you had a diminishment of anti-Semitism. Israel had been negotiating the Oslo Accords, and it looked like there was going to be peace with the Palestinians and consequently soon with the Islamic world. And in America, we had knocked down all of the barriers, all of the glass ceilings about Jews. We even got in 2000 to the idea that a man could run for vice president of the United States and essentially win the popular vote, who was not only a Jew, but an Orthodox Jew who could make the word 24/6 fully acceptable to the United States. So we could imagine that anti-Semitism was not only on the decline, but was going to what? Disappear. And we lived in a period of enormous sanitization, and the sanitization was an intriguing sanitization because for a period of time after the Holocaust, if you were an anti-Semite, you couldn't say so in public because you were embarrassed to be associated with those anti-Semites who had taken it to the most extreme. So the demography was interesting. It wasn't that anti-Semitism had dramatically declined. It was that the expression of anti-Semitism had been dramatically constrained. And then with each passing generation, you had, ironically, less and less of the percentage of population being anti-Semitic. Let me give you one example where we studied it and commissioned it, and this is from the mid-'80s. There was a Jewish banker by the name of Jerome Cartman in Baltimore who was involved in the savings and loan bank crisis. His wife was Shoshanna Cartman, who was the president of the Council of Major Presidents of American Jewish Organizations. And that is the umbrella organization of presidents of major Jewish organizations. By the way, I've yet to find a Jewish organization that calls itself a minor Jewish organization. And consequently, you could say that Shoshanna Cartman was one of the most powerful Jewish lay leaders in the United States, and I say this with reverence for Shoshanna Cartman. Shoshanna Cartman developed what you called in leadership presidentitis, meaning she had been president of many different organizations, but unlike many, she left every organization she was president of in better shape when she left than when she began. So I say that with great respect for her, who was a good friend. Her husband was involved in the banking crisis, and his bank was part of those banks that had $250 maximum withdrawal in any given week. And you could imagine that people would be infuriated who had put their money in a savings bank expecting to get 3 or 4% a year safely, who could not get access to the money that they had saved in $10, $20, $30, $50, $100 increments in case there was an emergency, etc. We did a study at that point, and we found something remarkable, which is that 89% of the people of Baltimore regarded Jerome Cartman as a corrupt banker. 11% of the people of Baltimore found Jerome Cartman a corrupt Jewish banker. You understand the difference? The intriguing thing, it was 86% of the Jews and only 6% of the non-Jewish community in the city of Baltimore. Meaning that in one sense, that wasn't paid attention to. Now, let me give you one other humorous introduction, and then you're going to cease to have humor from me. There was a great Jewish quipster The quipster was a man by the name of Milton Himmelfarb, who was then director of research for the American Jewish community. He is most famous for the following sentence, which has explained Jewish voting patterns for 60 years. He says, Jews earn like Episcopalians and they vote like Puerto Ricans. And they vote like Puerto Ricans voted when Puerto Ricans were Puerto Ricans, meaning that we were the only group whose voting patterns did not change as our income patterns went up the scale of American earning power. His second thing was an interesting statement. He said the easiest way to be booed by a Jewish audience is to tell them that anti-Semitism is a less severe a problem than they think it is. Said that in 1963. Now, I am not going to tell you that anti-Semitism is less severe a problem than you think it is. I'm going to tell you it's a different problem than you think it is. And I don't intend to get booed for that. I intend to provoke you a little bit to think about it in a different way. Let's add, okay, that's the deal we're going to make this evening, and I'm going to leave significant time for Q&A, but not for other speeches. I'm going to speak long enough that I don't need another speech, but if you want to challenge me, you're welcome to. Let me also put one more word in, which is I speak for myself. I don't represent the PJCC, I don't represent the Peninsula community, I don't represent my university. In fact, I was speaking in Poland when they passed the anti-Holocaust law, and I turned to my faculty and I said I had been working in Mexico, and Mexico had something called kidnap insurance. If you worked in Mexico, they were kidnapping lots of people, and you didn't want to know exactly how much your family was willing to pay for you to be ransomed. Are you worth $25,000? You're worth $50,000? You're worth $75,000? So people took out insurance. So I said to my faculty, I am probably going to be arrested in Poland because whatever my Polish colleagues say, I will say something more radical. And therefore, if they have to arrest somebody, they'll arrest me first. I don't want you to go for bail, but I will, I've set aside money for bail, but I want to make sure that I get a unanimous vote of protest from my faculty, and we don't make it like the rabbi who has a heart attack. Synagogue board meets an emergency meeting and they vote 12 to 11 with 9 abstentions to send them a get well card. Let's begin with something that's intriguing. If you look at the Pew survey, Judaism is the most popular religion in America. Now you say, how's that possible? Let me tell you why I think it's possible, because I would say, we could say it differently. Judaism is the least unpopular religion in America. Catholic Church is facing a tremendous problem of credibility in its pews, and it's facing a problem among its leadership between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives who were put in power by 2 conservative popes, and liberals who are now responding after years of a conservative papacy to a liberal pope. If you want to see 2 popes, you'll see an image of that. They're not really getting along that well. And the church itself is divided, and the confidence in the Roman Catholic Church, because of what happened with the cover-ups, is at an all-time low. And that is deeply problematic. Protestantism is divided over a number of issues, including evangelical Protestantism versus non-mainstream. Mainstream itself is divided over several issues, and consequently there is turmoil there in an extraordinary way. People have been influenced to be suspicious of Islam, and Eastern religions are not understood, and consequently the Jews are the most popular, the least unpopular religion. How can that be? How can that be at a moment in time when we are all experiencing a dramatic increase in the expression of anti-Semitism, And when the unthinkable happened, and the unthinkable that happened is Jews have been killed because they're Jews in places like Pittsburgh and Poway and now Jersey City, something that we could not have imagined possible when our grandparents and our parents came here, because they believed what? America was different. And they believed the promise of George Washington, who wrote in 1790 to the Newport Jewish congregation, Newport Hebrew congregation, happily to the government of the United States gives to persecution, to bigotry, no sanction, and to persecution, no assistance. And all of us came here because of the great belief that America was different. And we enjoyed that difference over a very long period of time. Some of you have gone through also, not only was America different, but America had a couple of things that were extraordinary. In the 1950s, the rule was you couldn't be too Jewish, T-O-O Jewish. There was a wonderful exhibit about too Jewish. One of the best examples of that is an old Philip Roth story called Eli the Fanatic, about suburban Jews, all of them committed to their synagogues, to their Jewish community centers and the like, who all of a sudden are horrified when one of them begins to take Judaism seriously and grows a beard and starts going to services, and they're what? They're frightened of him, because the rule was essentially you couldn't be too Jewish. The 60s happened, and all of a sudden you can be not only Jewish in private, but Jewish in public. And all of a sudden you had the idea of Jewish, if there was black power and black pride, they're developed in response to that Jewish power and Jewish pride. And Jews were able to express that in their personal life, in their political life, in public demonstrations for Israel, for Soviet Jewry. We've all lived through that, those of us who are of a certain age. I'll tell it to you in two anecdotes. There was a man by the name of Irving Shapiro who was brought in as Assistant General Counsel of DuPont at a point when DuPont was an anti-Semitic company. It later became owned by the Bronfmans, which would make it a little bit less anti-Semitic company. I don't mean that, I should say that nicer, which meant that it had ended. When he came in, his boss turned to him and said, you know, I want to give you a piece of advice. If you want to go far in this country, in this company, you'll change your name. Comes back 2 days later with 2 tickets to Detroit. Guy says, why do I want to go to Detroit? He says, I want you to tell my father that the name he brought me into the world with is not good enough for me to carry on. They said, we don't normally allow you folks into the country club, but we're making an exception for you. And he says, I don't play golf. And then what happens is, as he rises in the company, he belongs to Jewish Country Club, and all of a sudden lots of people want to go to the Jewish Country Club to be able to see the CEO at leisure, and he deliberately becomes chairman of the United Jewish Appeal to indicate that a new generation has arisen that feels comfortable being Jewish in public. Yitz Greenberg tells a story that when he was at Harvard in the 1950s, Jews didn't wear a yarmulke. He was a religious Jew with a number of other Orthodox rabbis who wore a hat. When they sat down in the class, they took off their hat. When they got up from the class, they put on that hat. He would go to Harvard Square, see these men walking with beautiful young ladies next to them in mini skirts, and he wouldn't be jealous of the women that they were with, but absolutely jealous of the fact that they could comfortably wear a yarmulke on the top of their head, because all of a sudden you could be a Jew in public. And when Hillel moved to the center of campus, the provost of Harvard, Henry Rosofsky, said, Jews have moved from the periphery of Harvard to the center of Harvard, and it's at the center of Harvard that we choose to remain. changed dramatically in the ethos. We've lived through that change in the ethos. We've seen Jews advance in banking, etc., etc. Let's take another two examples just to give you, and even our measuring tools don't quite work with it. ADL, and this is not critical of ADL, it's descriptive, and there's a difference. ADL has used the same measuring tool to measure anti-Semitism for 55 years. The greatness of a longitudinal study is that you can measure the differences over a period of time as you ask a question again and again and again. And one of the questions they asked is, do Jews control the economy? Now, if you asked, let's say, assuming the last year of the Obama administration, do Jews have an undue influence in the economy? You would have to answer, if you paid attention to it, with the answer yes. Secretary of Treasury was not only Jewish, but an Orthodox Jew. The head of the Federal Reserve was Jewish. The vice chairman of the Federal Reserve was an Israeli Rhodesian American Jew. His predecessor, her predecessor, was a man by the name of Shalom ben Bernanke. And his predecessor was a man by the name of Alan Greenspan. Jew, 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 all the way through on the Federal Reserve, and Jews as head of what? The Council of Economic Advisors, and Jews in the big banks. Consequently, if you asked, are Jews overrepresented in the economy? Absolutely. Are Jews in charge of the economy? Absolutely. Do Jews control the economy? That's a different question. That borders on a certain line. I went to Catholics in the Media with my then boss by the name of Steven Spielberg. Got up there and looked out at the audience and said in a very humorous and loving way, he said, "Oh my God, I didn't realize there were this many goyim." Everybody laughed and everybody laughed. Meaning that essentially the Jews had gone from the being constrained by quotas and glass ceilings and being constrained by advancement into something radically different. They also had the freedom to be Jews in public and not only in private. And those of us who are Jewishly committed in private as well as in public used to say, we now live in a wonderful world in which Jews are public Jews and private barbarians. And that is that you felt the freedom of that. What is and let's use a couple of more examples just to add to it. We also thought that Israel was established to solve the problem. Zionism was born to solve the problem of anti-Semitism. Zionism was born in 1881 and reborn in 1897 with a political program. Was born by two assimilated Jews. The first was Leo Pinsker, the second was Theodor Herzl. And both of them had been disappointed because they thought that Jews could ultimately assimilate and be accepted as part of the larger society. They could become citizens, and ultimately Herzl himself had voted about maybe we should be involved in a mass conversion. He then, after the Dreyfus trial, where the country that said liberty, equality, and fraternity was chanting death to Jews, began to understand that conversion would not work and assimilation would not do it. So the Jews were to become a normal people, a people like any other people. And a people like any other people, meaning you needed an army and a flag and a nation. And in fact, they celebrated the first time a Jewish hooker was arrested in Tel Aviv. That makes us now a normal people. So we thought that Israel was going to quench the fires of anti-Semitism. Soviet Union had collapsed. We thought that all of that would end. The Great Migration, which is a migration that our ancestors began in 1881, continued, and all of a sudden anti-Semitism would disappear. We had a very interesting thing happen in France. You had the Charlie Hebdo hyper-kosher slaughter. The most incredible thing about that is what the response was afterwards. The response afterwards was the President of France and the Prime Minister of France both said the identical statement. France without the Jews is not France. This is in a country where what? 60 years ago, 70 years ago, wanted to get rid of its Jews and wanted to exclude Jews from France. And all of a sudden, what is happening is the leadership is proclaiming, we want the Jews, we need the Jews, they are ours. Now, how is contemporary anti-Semitism different? And I'm going to give you a very basic element of it, which is a couple of fold. Number one, less people are anti-Semitic today than have been anti-Semitic. I'm talking about the United States. Less people are anti-Semitic today than have been before. But anti-Semitism has the megaphone of the internet and the social support system of the social networks. And the most important element is that if in today's society you feel free to hate, you feel free to express your hatred. Meaning that the constraint over the expression of hatred, has withered away. And the idea is that whatever you feel, you can say, you can express, you can what? Give voice to, and you find a network which is going to offer you a social support system for that. Anti-Semitism varies according to source: racial, religious, nationalist, or economic. It varies according to the level of preoccupation. How concerned are the people with the Jews? And how concerned are the anti-Semites with the Jews? And for the Jews, the genius of America for 300 years has been the Jews were always present on that pecking order, but never one, never two, never three, never four. And even today, with all of the elements of anti-Semitism, the Jews are down the totem pole, but not out of sight and not out of mind, and we haven't imagined that we would be in such prominence. But ironically, something else has also happened, which is society can come into a virtual consensus that anti-Semitism is bad and can be aroused by anti-Semitism. But the irony is it is not as responsive to other forms of hatred, and consequently other communities that are suffering with the expression of hatred end up being in a situation of Jew envy. Envy for the attention that is being paid to anti-Semitism and the uniform attention that's being paid to anti-Semitism in this society. Let's add to the problem in a couple of Let's add to the problem in a couple of ways, and if you disagree with me, we'll give you the opportunity to disagree with me as well. There's a total gap between the ways in which Jews perceive themselves and the way in which we are perceived by others. Let's take the first gap, which is ask anybody, how many Jews do you think there are in America, and how many Jews do you think there are in the world? Do you know what the average answer for the number of Jews in America ends up being? It ends up being between 20 million and 50 million. It ends up being between 20 million and 50 million because why? We are visible. And being visible in that sense, everybody is, quotation marks, get into this notion of everybody is Jewish. So we perceive ourselves as a minority, and we are perceived by others as a successful part, a privileged part of the white majority. So we are on the one hand conditionally white, and then we're unconditionally privileged in a very real way. Israel is perceived as a regional military superpower and as an economic marvel. Israel, in a very interesting way, solved the two issues that had been problematic to any element of consideration of its future. It solved the question of water. Solved the question of water in two ways. And here we speak with shame as Californians. Israel recycles 87% of its water. California recycles 17% of its water. California recycles 17% of its water, meaning that 70% of our water could be saved if we mimicked what? The way in which Israel rescues its water. Plus, Israel has now engaged in relatively inexpensive desalination and could end up, ironically, being a water provider to the Middle East. And if it becomes a water provider to the Middle East, there is no history of a country going to war with that which is providing the water for it, unless it is to take over the water resources that it has. The second is that Israel is now a energy provider, which we used to joke when I was a kid that Moses took the wrong turn. If he'd gone to Saudi Arabia, the conditions would have been different. Israel now has discovered all of this natural gas in the Mediterranean Sea, and is now in an arrangement with Cyprus to marshal that. And if there were a different world, it would be an arrangement with Lebanon to marshal that. But Israel now has done that. Plus, Israel is what you call startup nation, a tech marvel. But the tech marvel that Israel is now is a tech marvel, which means that it is equipped to handle the problems of globalization. And I can tell you this from a personal story. My brother-in-law was the former head of the Israel EPA. And Israel was serious in his generation, at least, about the environment. And he used to think that he was in a backwater in terms of scientific research when he was a young man. As he grew older, he discovered that he was 4 hours from Europe, 5 hours, 3 hours and 4 hours and 5 hours from Eastern Europe, 8 or 9 hours from the United States, and 10 or 11 hours from Asia, and he was living in the quotation marks center of the world. And all of a sudden his scientific career had a global outreach because Israel was equipped for globalization. And it is what the beneficiary of globalization, as the Jews are the beneficiary of globalization. And in one of my other lectures, we'll talk about what that represents. So where are we now in the 21st century? One, there is less anti-Semitism numerically, but a much, much, much greater freedom to express anti-Semitism on the part of the anti-Semites, who feel empowered to do it, who have the megaphone of the combination of the internet and also the expressions when they do it, of having it again said again and again and again. There is the agitation on the part of the Jewish community that is responsive to all of this, and therefore we pay attention to it in a very particular way. And let's give one example of that. We make a lot out of BDS, but in a very interesting way, Israel will tell you that BDS has had zero impact on it economically. And AIPAC, which is supposedly the major representative of the pro-Israel alliances in the United States, will tell you privately that they don't consider BDS a serious issue. Other organizations are handling it. Now, it's a problem in terms of delegitimation, but it's been a total failure in terms of having actual impact. But what it presents in terms of agitation is enormously serious. We are perceived as privileged, which means that in one sense, until there is this level of murder, and until there are the attacks on the Orthodox, who are what? The most visible Jews, they have what? They have the equivalent of what the yellow star is, because they have the beard, the yarmulke, and the kaftan, and the modest dress, and all of that stuff. Until we have attacks on them, the Jews are regarded. How can you be prejudiced, and how can anti-Semitism be real if you are such people of privilege? And furthermore, we end up being that Jews are opposed by certain groups who have a tolerance for anti-Semitism. This is anti-Semitism on the left. Jews are opposed because of other elements of Jewish culture. So, for example, the Women's March will employ Louis Farrakhan, who is clearly and openly anti-Semitic, and by the way, anti-woman, but again represents a minority because the Jews are privileged, a white privileged majority, and therefore cannot have real problems and real grievances, and consequently there is a serious problem. Let's give you a couple of minutes of good news. I spoke in Pittsburgh in the aftermath on the year anniversary of the anti-Semitism in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh shows us something very interesting. What happened in Pittsburgh is that civility held. Civility held in the following way, which is that the governor was there, the mayor was there, the district attorney, the police chief, and all the elements of society, saying we don't want hatred to define us, we want to be defined as the anti-hatred. The Pittsburgh Steelers put a Jewish star on their logo. 100 Pittsburgh Steelers, big guys, 300-pounders, walked into the funeral of two of the men because their sister had worked for the Pittsburgh Steelers. The entire team came out to the funeral as a statement of what? Of communal solidarity. Pittsburgh Penguins came out with a Jewish star. The World Series stopped for a moment of silence in memory of the Pittsburgh 11. Mrs. Rogers came out because what? Squirrel Hill was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. The moral leadership of America came out, and every writer who came from Pittsburgh started writing about what? Their hometown and what it represented. And the Pittsburgh newspaper comes out with the words Yit Kadal V'Yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah. So what happens in the aftermath of Pittsburgh is not that hate triumphs, but that solidarity comes in and says we don't want hatred as part of this community. And that means that civility held. There were two elements of bad news. First element of bad news is that the American president could come but not speak. The reason the American president could not speak is twofold. Number one, it is not within the wheelhouse of the current occupant of the White House to bring the nation together. He is fully capable of turning the nation apart. And furthermore, there was a sense that after Charlottesville, he didn't have the moral stature to bring in the nation together with regard to that. And the second is that the Israeli ambassador had to remain silent. And that is for actually three reasons. The first is because of the deep partisan nature of this government, this Israeli government's support for one of the political parties and its alliance with elements that are potentially anti-Semitic without wanting to be allied with them. The second is because of a tremendous mistake that was made in Paris in the aftermath of the hyper-kasher Charlie Hebdo issue. What was the tremendous mistake in Paris? The tremendous mistake in Paris was that the Prime Minister of Israel got up and said, "Come to Israel, we can protect you, come home." The moment in which France was saying, "These are ours, these are Frenchmen, they are part of Europe," he was reinforcing, as it were, the image of Jews as a non-European, non-French element. Forgetting for a moment that Israel then was also saying, but again, Iran may be able to what? Nuclearize and vaporize us with the nuclear bombs, so protection is a peculiar element. But he said essentially, come home, and the American Jews were not going to accept that classical notion of Zionism, which is it's time to get out and it's time to leave because this is not your home, you belong elsewhere. And that's a hyper-minority view among American Judaism and not one that has real resonance and credibility for the American Jewish community. We have discovered a couple of things. We've discovered that Israel can not only fan the flames of it can not only quench the fires, but it can fan the flames. And we've also discovered something else, which is that it's developed its own vocabulary, or the haters of Jews have developed its own vocabulary that have allowed it to say, we're not anti-Semitic, we're merely anti-Zionist. And let me just touch for 1 second, what are the three major differences where you can identify what is legitimate criticism of the state of Israel with what is illegitimate criticism that moves toward anti-Semitism. They are the three Ds: double standards, delegitimation, demonization. Double standards is when you judge Israel by one standard and everybody else by another standard. If, for example, the attacks on Dresden were legitimate in World War II, then the question becomes, what's your criteria for saying that the attacks on Gaza are illegitimate? That's a double standard. Let's admit it's a double standard. We Jews have the right to hold Jews to higher standards, but that's a double standard. The second is delegitimation, which is you move from Israel is holding other people's territory to therefore it has no right to exist. If you go to Australia, every ceremony begins with the idea that we now pay homage to our Aboriginal ancestors who were part of this land, an integral part of this land, but nobody's telling the Australians to what? To give the land back to the Aborigines. You go to Canada, the same statement is made in Canada. And you come to certain segments in the United States, we may pay homage to the Native Americans, but we're what? Not giving back the United States of America to Native Americans. So you move from Israel has made X, Y, and Z mistakes to the idea that it's delegitimate. And the third is you go to demonization, which is Israel is the source of all evil. And that is that it's behaving in a demonic fashion. And the intriguing thing about that was until very recently, we had and we'll talk about this a little bit in another lecture, until very recently, and on the Middle East you can only talk about hours, not even days anymore. Till very recently, you had a strategic alliance between Sunni Muslims and Israel against Shia. And people were comfortable, Sunni were comfortable with Israel having an atomic bomb, but not the Shiites having an atomic bomb. But events in the last several months have changed that equation in a peculiar way, and that becomes a difficult thing. What does that mean now in terms of what we have to do with regard to anti-Semitism? Number one, Jews, well, let me add one more statement before I come to what we have to do. We have one other peculiar element in our midst. Well, two other peculiar elements, I'll talk about both. The optimist is the woman who puts on her shoes after I say in conclusion for the third time. The right is saying Jews will not replace us, the ultra-right. What do they mean by that? They ironically do not mean that Jews are going to replace us. They're essentially saying that we're not going to allow America to invite all of these multiple immigrant groups that are going to destroy the basis of power of the white master race. It's not Jews per Jews who are going to replace us. It is all of the people, the multiple levels of immigrant groups invited into the United States. Current iteration is the Hispanic, the Mexican, and the like, and that's what's going to replace us. The same thing, for example, in Poland, when they say Jews are not going to replace us, you could have said that in Poland when Jews were 10% of Polish society, 30 and 40% of Polish cities, 80% of doctors in certain communities, but not when there's 25,000 people in a country of 60 million. But what they're saying is we're not going to allow other cultural migrants to come in and destroy our power infrastructure. The irony is that white power that we've seen since the 60s, we've seen 50 years of the erosion of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant power basis, and we now have a really multicultural society. California is one example of that, in which whites are a minority of those born. Texas is going to be like that. And the other thing demographically is we're going to be in a situation where the white population is not reproducing itself. And without immigration, we are going to lose all of the elements of work that is essential. The left has a second element, which is anti-Semitism does not seem to be disqualifying on the left. What appalls me sometimes is people say, well, she shares all of her values, but she's an anti-Semite. And I say the moment that happens, when he or she shares all of our values, but is an anti-Semite, that's not all of my values. That disqualifies one element of it. Okay, let's go to the question of what can we do, and we'll wrap it up with this and then open up to questions, attacks, responses, etc. Number one, Jews are no longer powerless. We are an empowered population, privileged economically, articulate educationally, and we have the capacity to use that power to achieve significant political goals, including self-protection. Number two, we cannot work on this problem alone. We have to combat the climate of permissible hatred in our society, and also the sense of what's been introduced most recently, which is the world is on a tipping point about to end. Agitation rather than stability is one of the sources that allows all sorts of hatreds to flourish. The world existed yesterday. The world will exist tomorrow. There still are major elements of stability in the world despite the agitation, but we live in a society in which there's a constant agitation. That agitation is, again, triggered by a president who lives in a world of agitation, a media that can't keep its eyes off agitation in a variety of ways, and the sense that agitation is a permanent part of this. Let's add one other element to it. It is ironic that is happening at a time in which the economic growth of the United States since 2009 has been steady. The percentage of economic growth has been steady. The percentage of job growth has been steady, transforming but steady. And we're having all of this agitation at a time of prosperity, relatively speaking, for at least large segments of the society. Woe to us if this were occurring in 2008, when you could feel that the world, when you could legitimately feel that the world was coming to an end. Woe to us if it could happen then, but we're having this in a moment of prosperity. We have to work on civility. We have to lower the temperature dramatically. And equally, and I'm going to say this and take out my phone, I got an email from my daughter who's just written a column, who says that my granddaughter was afraid to go to the kosher supermarket. My granddaughter is the daughter and granddaughter of rabbis. She's a kid whom I took skiing yesterday who jumped off a major mogul, who wanted to go up on a 40-foot mogul, but her grandfather said only with your parents, not with your grandparents. And who's got real guts intellectually and athletically and everything else. And she says to her mother, I'm scared. Now, I read that as a grandfather with fear and trembling, and I said, if my kid is scared, what happens to other kids who don't have all of the positive reinforcement of Jewishness to counterbalance that? She ended up going to the kosher supermarket. She ended up getting a little bit more candy than she thought she might, and the like, but the kid was scared. It should not be scary to be Jewish. It should be joyous. It should be celebrative. It should be wonderful. We need allies in this. We need civility to be restored. We need stability to be restored. And we need solidarity. And we also need not to forget that being Jewish is not about suffering together. It's about sharing together and being together, celebrating together, living together, and achieving a higher purpose. I wish I could give you a different point. In this lecture, I've only focused on America. I can go country, in one lecture I will go country by country on the shape of anti-Semitism today. But we live in a very particular time, and the problem is that we must insist that civility holds. If it doesn't hold, then we are probably number 4 on the target list, but there will be lots of people taking joy at the downfall of the Jewish community. Thank you very much.